researchers in Australia. And so we thought it would be a good idea, and people might have not time because it's been busy, but enjoy actually taking a moment just to reflect on what they've been doing. So the research they've been doing, and these are short papers. These are 3,000 word papers, and deliberately focused on the authors. So, you know, it wasn't a discussion of bringing a whole heap of other literature. It's actually highlighting what these people are doing. So we got a great response, and the people that you see in the special issue, the people that, you know, responded, and they've done magnificently in writing their short papers. So looking forward to hearing it. And if you can't get the issue, I'm sure Dorothy or I can get you a copy of it. So it's not a problem. We struck a little bit of a hiccup in trying to give it all to you anyhow, but you might hopefully be ACL members and can get it. But if you can't get it, we'll get you a copy. Not a problem.
Right. Well, here we go.
Okay, thank you. Dorothy and Joan, would you like to talk about school improvement?
Thank you, Christine and Fiona, for this, the organisation of this, and being the guinea pigs straight off the taxi rank, I suppose. Hopefully we can start this ball rolling. I'm going to share a little PowerPoint because the visual and the auditory is often a good key to keep you enthralled. Bear with me and I'll get that up. This was a great privilege for us to be able to write a paper, as David just said, relatively short but succinct was the name of the game, and it gave us that opportunity to be able to do that. So our work from the University of Southern Queensland is under the umbrella of what we call the Leadership Research International Group, and for 20 years plus, Dorothy's been there since the beginning. I came very soon after. The cumulative and longitudinal strength of research and development from the Leadership Research International Group, which has ebbed and flowed in numbers and in, I suppose, density of work. But key to that has been a school improvement project, which we have run for all of that time. As in any research and development, this is not just as one principal said to me, I don't want the Avon product off the shelf. I want something that is custom built for what we need in our context. And of course, that's exactly what we do. And therefore, the research and development of this school improvement project has just grown from strength to strength. And in saying that, it's not just improving some little package. As we've said here, our key foci are these four pillars, you might say: an understanding of the importance of leadership in sustaining ongoing processes. That whole business, we hear the rhetoric of capacity building, sustaining, but really the how to and the importance of that is absolutely imperative. Secondly, we definitely come with a co-research approach, working directly with school leadership teams. And it's not just the principal, but key to that is the principal's commitment to it, as I'll reiterate later as well. Alignment of a school's aspirational vision for learning with their collaborative development of a pedagogical framework. And overall, it's leadership within that context that is absolutely important. So I don't expect you to read all of that. If you've read the paper, this figure of this table is from there. I've just broken it into two bits, but it is just...
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, I'm not sure if anyone else is seeing this, but we can't see actually your whole presentation. Is that the same for everybody? I can only see the PowerPoint.
Yes, I just see the title slide.
Yeah.
It's not progressing. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, we might unfortunately have to go back to just progressing each slide. I tried to put it on the slideshow. Back here. You're seeing that, and is it progressing now? All right, I have to do it manually. All right, I beg your pardon. So I was just going through what's on that slide that I think you can all see now. And then going through to the fact that within the paper, we've got a table to show just to track that, that record of co-research funded projects, which have been the key ones, instrumental in developing key concepts upon which we build this whole school improvement process. And the publication, some of the key publications that have come out of that. So the key concepts around the whole business of what we call micro-pedagogical deepening, invoking reaction. This is all to do with capacity building. The key concepts of embedding practice into contexts, and the whole thing about system school leadership has been important too. There's more of that to come. The next part of that table, if you've already read the paper, is the more recent, as in the second decade of work, which is built on the key concepts of the School Improvement Project. And in many cases, this has been built upon by co-research projects, but also doctoral work. And some of those doctoral students are both colleagues and fellows of the school who have picked up on key concepts, or others who from school base. So current understandings, our current understandings and the assumptions and concepts underpinning this continuous learning is realised through our connection, our experience with schools and with school and system personnel. So this probably has become quite a key part of us being able to show the processes, the strategies, the structures through to leadership. And I haven't got time to explain it all now, but that last right-hand column actually exemplifies what we call parallel leadership. So principal leadership together with teacher leadership and absolute togetherness is the collective responsibility. And at various stages of that process, the dominance of one or the other is needed and exemplified in that way. So that little diagram hopefully helps to cover that. Moving on then, our firm belief, or our firm beliefs are that leadership is key to the success of any school improvement journey, something that I suppose a lot of people would say, but definitely in the how, leadership is coupled with an understanding of collective responsibility. Teacher leaders, not necessarily formal leadership roles, which I say have got the label on the forehead type of thing, but those who rise to the occasion and exemplify the qualities of teacher leadership. The principal must commit to a process, although he or she is not the leader of the actual management of this process, he or she must be committed to, of course, enabling strategic fellows within the school community to take that lead and, of course, be able to provide the resources required for that. The principal's commitment to persist and see that through is important. Many a times we've said to principals who are doing and have done a great job, don't leave too early. You must see this through. Commitment to building capacity, or more, I think what we like to say, enabling capacity building for that long-term sustainability is really the key point. And of course, that's never a static end point. It goes on forever. So key to our learnings is how to achieve that overall. 3 points there that we have worked with and published in. And then current and future research, of course, we're never ended either. And key to this now is our realization that, I think it's a pretty well-known fact, that schools and systems are working, or are being forced maybe to work together a lot more closely than ever before. So we hope that there is ongoing continual work being done in that alignment. Relationship of the principals within the system is imperative. I mean, many a principal we've got in both doctoral work and the work that we do with these schools, working with the principals is as much part of the job, you might say, as working with the whole school community. Do you want to talk about the last one?
and just very quickly at the end of that is that when we developed this concept of parallel leadership many years ago, the way in which it now operates is quite different because times have changed. There's a whole new world, and particularly related to the I guess political and I guess the political relationship between systems and schools and the accountability frameworks that sit around that. The other thing is that teacher leadership, we actually are working with an international group, 10 different countries, looking at what this concept of teacher leadership looks like, because it's a bit like, you know, teacher leadership is a concept that people in other countries are saying we should be doing this, but they don't know what it is. So we're saying, well, what is it? What does it look like when you work in Mexico or in China or in Spain, yes, or Canada,
South Africa, Tanzania,
or Colombia. So that's another area that quite interests us, and that's our current work. So that whole area of systems, school alignment to us is so important for sustainability, and also our interest in teacher leadership across the world, I guess, is driving our current work.
So it's ongoing. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you both for presenting what is such a fascinating presentation on sustaining leadership research. And I think this just demonstrates that we'd all like so much longer to be able to share our work. And I'd just like to share at this moment that we are now going to be having monthly sessions for members to be able to share their research now that we don't have an end of year conference. So you can find out more about that in our newsletter as those events are coming up. Christine Edwards-Groves, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing about your work on middle leaders. Go for it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I haven't got a PowerPoint, so you're just going to have to, endure a free flow conversation. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to be presenting my work today on middle leading on behalf of myself and my co-researcher and co-author, Peter Grutenbaugh, who some of you might know. We've been doing some work, particularly in Australia and with our international colleagues in Sweden on a focus area on middle leading. When we talk about middle leading, it's really sort of hitched into the middle of a school organisation. So Joan and Dorothy, is it? Sorry, you were talking about teacher and teacher leaders and the connection in school development. And we're kind of really situating our work right in that pocket. So we're really interested in those people in a school structure who are leading professional development. That's part of their role. So they've got both a teaching and a leading role in schools. So for many of the people that we have become very interested in working with, and because of our own histories, where we've got one foot in a teaching role all the time. We're still classroom teachers, but we're also given responsibilities for leading the professional development trajectory of a particular school. And so it's really quite a site-based view of what leading is. It's positional in the respect that it both has impact on the school level in terms of the classroom and the teaching practices, but also in terms of the leadership or the school executive level. So it's these people that we're interested in are not necessarily on the leadership team. They may be in some cases, and particularly in smaller cases. I do a lot of my research in rural areas, so in smaller areas in New South Wales, so sometimes the schools are smaller. So it's really that positional place where there is a responsibility for teaching and leading the professional learning. One of the reasons why we became interested in this is not discounting the role of the leader, i.e. the principal in school development and change. It is that part of the role of these people, the middle leaders, if you like, really have got more traction in terms of being able to get at. It's a both and role because they're also teaching and they're also required to think about their own practices as teachers in that role. So that's one reason why we're really kind of interested in their work. our work over the years have sort of delineated a number of key practices, if you like, that that we've been able to identify as being making up the kind of work that these people do. For example, I talked about leading and teaching. Both of these roles are mutually informed in the practices that teachers engage with, or these leaders engage with in the schools, but they also have a managing and facilitating role and a collaborating and communicating role. So these kind of all, you know, really answer to or fit in with the work that we just heard from Joan and Dorothy, but it's also this kind of interest in the actual practices of these people. What are they actually doing in the moment or in the moments of leading the professional development in their school sites? What is the thing that makes it happen here in this school? So it's really a site-based view of the kind of practices that these folk are engaged in. So we've sort of picked out, you know, these kind of frames. Part of our understanding about when we're studying the practices, what's actually happening, we've kind of developed an understanding around what are the dimensions then of relational trust. And it's been a big feature of the kind of work that we've been doing in recent years in particular, because relational trust, how do we get trust facilitated, sustained in particular sites? And this notion around trust has come up probably in all of our work when we're thinking about leadership. But in our research, and particularly the analysis, has led us to be able to see that actually it's a multi-dimensional kind of thing. It's not just that we are trusted, but that there are, what we've sort of found is 5 dimensions of trust that actually really encapsulate the kind of practices that that these middle leaders both carry with them as they engage in the practice. And one of the key things that we've found is it's because they're actually going through the processes of changing for themselves as teachers and leaders in their practice, is that they have a true sense of what is realistic here. So there's a pragmatic dimension of the kind of work that these people are working with. So that's a really important thing in relationship to the how do we both understand the 5 dimensions of relational trust, and what does it actually mean for sustaining professional change in schools among teachers. So there's that is a really critical point. The other thing that we've kind of really starting to come to understand now is this notion around generative leadership. So leadership's a practice of middle leading, and leading itself generates other leading practices. So part of being a teacher in a site where you're facilitating professional development and change is that it itself and the practices, and because of our focus on practice, the practices themselves are actually generative of other leading practices. So again, it really hooks around the notion around teacher leading, not in and of its own self, but what it actually facilitates in terms of what it generates for future leading practices in sites. And that's one of the, I think, a really interesting dimension of the kind of work that we're doing at the moment in relationship to that. So so pulling some of these ideas together, and we've all been interested in and watching by the kind of work on leadership, say for example in Canada, Hargraves and Fullan, for example, Fink and other people, particularly in the Ontario site, where at the moment we're in a position, particularly around our focus on middle leading rather than middle management in a system perspective, where we've just begun to, or just prior to COVID, I should say, begun a project called it's what we're calling a Pacific Rim project on middle leading. So we've actually got a number of folk from Ontario in particular really interested in our approach and thinking about middle leading and how do we support these middle leaders themselves. So there's a lot of development of how do I facilitate the development of the principal as a leader, but what does it mean for these folk in the middle when we're leading from the middle? So we've been, doing some work with some folk in British Columbia, in Canada, in Ontario, in Canada, who are really interested in the site-based notion that we draw from in terms of our work, and sort of across the other side in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Philippines, New Zealand and Australia. So we've got this little lovely kind of work at the moment where there's groups of people who are very, very interested in how do we support then the development of these folk who lead from the middle, and picking up these other dimensions that I said around how it generates leading itself, but also how we can support them in their own practice development. And I'd like to just finish there.
Thank you. It's great to hear from you, and it's fascinating to hear your global work that you're doing. And when we have question time, I have some questions I'd like to ask you, and I'm sure that others will as well, about your global work in middle leadership and looking at generative leading. Fiona Longmuir, Student Agency, go for it.
I'm at unmute button. Thanks, Chris. Both Chris's, thank you very much, and everyone else. Okay, so my paper that I contributed was called Intersections of Educational Leadership, Educational Change and Student Empowerment. And I am an early career researcher, so I really love this opportunity to kind of reflect on some of the things I've done and some of the things perhaps I'm interested in looking at further as I keep working. So I kind of started with this idea that calls for change in education, it's a really interesting notion. It's pervasive in educational leadership. There's a lot of attention around managing change and why we need to change and these aspects. I also was interested that lots of people argue that when we take, a big broad view of general schooling arrangements, that they're actually really quite difficult to change. Although saying that right now, I'm in Melbourne in lockdown, and here, like most places around the globe, schooling has changed an awful lot just recently. But outside of COVID times, and aside from probably thinking around sort of the fringes of education, homeschooling, alternative settings, those kind of things, at the broad level, most students experience education in school settings that are structured and arranged in the ways that they were for their grandparents. Tyke and Tobin coined the phrase grammars of schooling in the mid-90s, and they use this to refer to the kind of persistent and pervasive arrangements that have historically defined schools. So to me, that's thinking about things like age-based grouping, discrete discipline teaching, contained classroom spaces and that kind of stuff that we still see in most schools. There's also lots of indications that some of these mainstream schooling arrangements don't work for many. There's high numbers of students who are completely disenfranchised from mainstream schools. A report from Watterson and O'Connell, I think is the right name, last year suggested there's up to 50,000 students in Australia that are not in any educational setting. We also know that we have huge numbers of students who are at schools but are struggling within classrooms. On top of that, we have increasing rates of wellbeing and mental health issues for students, as well as increasing rates of mental health issues and wellbeing issues for teachers and principals, which of course then impacts on attention and attraction and retention, which is another area of research that I've been involved in. So I guess in thinking about these issues and big calls for change, in my article, I tried to consider ways that the work of educational leaders can facilitate change within and beyond their schools by disrupting the dynamics of agency and power that have traditionally existed between students, teachers and school leaders. So in some of my research, I've explored the interaction between leadership practices, school improvement approaches and student empowerment, and how these can enable and constrain greater levels of disruptive change. I have found in the limited, admittedly, research that I've been able to do so far that are focused on relationships, and particularly what was interesting was relationships that were direct connections between leaders and students, and how a willingness to share some power over school arrangements, structures and practices led to more innovative changes and ways of operating that supported students to engage with education in productive and meaningful ways. As I outline in my paper, my research work has involved me in talking to educational leaders and students who have left mainstream schools on one hand, and I've also spoken to leaders and students in schools where students are given more say in their schooling experiences. what I saw there really got me interested in how educational leaders can kind of leverage the knowledges, perspectives and interests of students and bring that to their leadership work in order to improve and change schools. So we know student voice has been much more prominent over recent years, and it's really become quite important in the ways that we think about schooling and education. It influences the work of teachers and school leaders. However, I think that's still mostly generally within classrooms and around how students participate in their learning decisions and learning choices. When it is at a school level, it's often representational. So it's select students who get to have a say and get to participate. And historically, school level student voice has also been somewhat tokenistic. Conceptually, I think student voice is a much used term, but it's quite blurry. It can encompass student choice, student agency and student empowerment. I'm actually right now trying to do some work and some writing to develop a bit more conceptual and theoretical understandings of the nuances of these and how they relate to practices in schools in different ways. But for this paper and for now, I'm kind of attached to the term student empowerment, as I think it captures the attention that we need to give to the power structures and relationships that have played a strong role in the maintenance of those grammars of schooling. So in the work that I have done, I've found that educational leaders who find ways to more authentically include and engage all students and empower them to participate in the school level decisions about all aspects of their schooling can generate a greater variety of ideas and innovations for school improvement. I've seen in some cases that this change in where students are positioned within the power relationships of schools has the potential to contribute to broader transformational ideas and perhaps could help respond to some of the challenges that we identified earlier. Thanks. I was probably faster than I should have been, but that's it. Thank you.
You are perfectly on time, if not just ever so slightly over, but well done. Delivered perfectly. Thank you. I'm looking forward to asking you some questions at the end. It's really piqued my interest. Okay, next we have Helen Stokes on trauma-informed practice. Welcome, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Christine. This work is a body of work I've been doing over the past 5 years with Tom Brunzell, who is my industry partner who works at Berry Street, a family and children's services organisation. He was the other co-author with me. So we were looking at, we've done research in a number of different schools around what we call the TIPE model, the Trauma-Informed Positive Education model. That was a model that he developed actually in his PhD. So, and we've been looking at how it has then been implemented in schools. So the article was drawing together the different research that we've done in the different schools over about the past 5 years. And this research is still continuing. We're working in different groups of schools. So we really started looking first at student outcomes, but if you look at student outcomes, you've got to go back really and then look at what's happening in regard to leadership. And so we're then looking at how you move from being trauma affected to trauma aware. It's in a context of social inequality when students are coming to school with unmet needs, emotional, social and learning needs. And also in a context where the principals were reporting that what they were currently doing was not working in their schools for both themselves and for teachers, but they were wanting to support what was their teachers in both pedagogically and wellbeing within the school. So, and also support their ability to support vulnerable students in the school. So just very quickly, the 3 levels of TIPE are about facilitating self-regulation is level 1, then increasing relational capacity, and then the 3rd level is increasing psychological resources for wellbeing. So it's very much a wellbeing sort of model. But what we found was that when it was used both in a pedagogical way and with wellbeing, it actually had much more impact in regard to students and what was happening for them. So looking at your model, Joan and Dorothy, I can see all the things in there in terms of what we saw happening in the schools, very much related to that. So it was about developing a shared language and a shared culture within the schools, and very much meeting the professional learning needs of the teachers in regard to how do they deliver this model, both in terms of wellbeing and in the classroom in terms of their pedagogy. And the way that they did that around modelling of the model and also embedding it in the rituals of the school. What we found was it was actually much easier to implement, probably more successfully in a primary school than a secondary school. We found that there was a change if it was only implemented through the pastoral care system as it was in the secondary school. It had much less impact on student outcomes. But if it was implemented through the curriculum, as it was when we looked at the primary schools, it really did impact in terms of the curriculum, the student outcomes. So, but we found it also implemented in terms of both wellbeing and student outcomes for both primary and secondary. So what we then went back to was what actually made a difference in terms of leadership there, and then what we needed to be looking at into the future. And so we found what we've done so far was really probably a first stage of looking at how it was implemented in schools, but that what we actually then need to go back into schools and look at how leaders are working with teachers to develop what we were terming trauma-aware communities of practice. And that's the stage of the research that we're going into now and working with different schools, thinking about your research there, Fiona, where we're working with the Berry Street schools, which are special schools for kids who are disengaged from education and out-of-home care, and what works for them. So that's sort of what we've sort of come to for the future and in the area we're working in. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Helen, thank you. It's great to see such a fine intersection between your work and the work of others, and also really interesting for us to hear the kinds of partnerships that you can have in educational leadership research in Australia. I'm sure that we all have more questions to ask you at the end. Thank you. David Gurr, Leadership Impact.
Yes, it is. I will put up a PowerPoint. Not a very exciting PowerPoint, but nevertheless a PowerPoint. Let me just start by just noting a couple of things. Leading and Managing's only had 5 editors. 3 of them are here. Peter Gron, of course, was the founder of Leading and Managing. It was his idea, and he and Ian Ling did the first few years and got the journal off to a flying start. So, Peter, I hope you're suitably proud of how it's been developing over time. I think 26 years now, so it's pretty amazing. Peter was also, and we all look fondly on the first paper we ever got published, and the first paper I ever got published was with Peter in Leading and Managing, and it was one where I had a little bit of a dig at him, and he called me up on the phone and said, David, look, if you're going to criticise me, you better come out and have a chat so I tell you how to do it properly. And so I did. I ended up going to Monash, and he was telling me how to write it properly. So Dorothy, of course, is the other person, Marion Lewis, who's been doing it with Dorothy for so many years, and I looked after it for a few years in the early thousands. Peter, congratulations on the journal, because it's been great. And just to acknowledge Brian as well, because Brian's been my doctoral supervisor and mentor and colleague, co-author with Tanya and with Fiona. So just to acknowledge Brian there as well. It's great to see him. So we focused our work on this notion of school leadership that matters, and Laurie Laurie should have been here, but I'm not sure. He lives in the country in Victoria, so he's allowed to go off and swan around and do things that we in Melbourne aren't allowed to do. So I don't know what's happened to him. Anyhow, so we start the paper by just touching base with what we believe in. And so these are simply statements and beliefs and propositions that guide us in our work, in our research. It comes from our reading of the literature on educational leadership and schools, our research within that space. We don't claim any uniqueness with these, but I think the beliefs are important. You know, students can learn, schools can be good, leadership's important, we can develop leadership. So that's a sequence that we think is important to state, otherwise we wouldn't be in sort of running postgraduate courses in educational leadership. And then we have this notion of 7 things that guide us in terms of, it's a framework. We have several frameworks, but this is the one that guides our courses and really we go back to all the time. So that notion of personal, you have to develop yourself. And then there's that series of 4 things that Leithwood and colleagues have been championing over many years, and some of our research in successful school leadership has simply reinforced that these 4 things are important. I forgot influencing. So leadership starts from within, then leadership is about influencing. That's an old notion of, you know, leadership does something to people. It does. It's manipulative, if you like. It's deliberate. All those horrible things, but it's also good. And then you've got the 4 things: leadership's direction, developing people, the organisation, and then educational leadership is about improving teaching and learning. And then back to a general leadership statement at the end, that leadership is responding to the broader context. And in fact, we would argue that it actually influences. Good leadership can influence the broader context. So those 7 things, we've put it together in recent times. We did a paper a couple of years ago called Leadership in Times of Uncertainty, and didn't realise it'd actually be quite topical this year. So it came out in a couple other versions this year, and one version is in the International Studies in Educational Administration, which I actually currently edit, and we've got 4 special issues on educational responses to the pandemic. 3 are out, 1 more to come, and that paper's in there. Brian's got a paper in the first issue of that, and I'll in the chat I'll just put the link to it because they're all freely available as open access. Scott's got a wonderful paper with a multitude of Australian authors. I think about 7 or 8 people, Scott. Just have a look at those. I'm just putting this up to say that, you know, when you get those sort of frameworks, you can do things with them. And this was just us playing with that framework and saying, those frameworks, the leadership domains, we think are pretty enduring, but the capabilities might switch around and change. So what you put on that outer circle will change over time, will change as you develop, will change as circumstances develop. Then in the paper, we just cover 3 areas that we've been doing a fair bit of work in. So successful school leadership. We've been involved in the International Successful School Principalship Project, which is now coming into its 20th year very soon. I've got to say, Brian got me involved in that. One day I passed him in the hallway when we were actually allowed to be on universities. Passed him in the hallway and he said, I've got a meeting in 2 weeks in Nottingham. I can't go. Do you want to go? And that was started me getting involved in this project. And we've got a model from that I can show later, or you can pick up in the paper. That's been important because the notion of success is broader than effectiveness, and it stemmed out of work that Chris Day was doing in the 90s. And he was concerned that the effective schools movement was just too narrow. He wanted to broaden it into that notion of success. So success means, yes, you can do well on the you know, the standardized testing or whatever testing, NAPLAN, or whatever it is you want to look at, but schools do more than that. And when you go into schools, of course, people in schools will tell you all the things that they do. So it's that notion of leading a really good broad school. So we've done some work in that. And then we've also been doing some work in middle leaders, and this has mostly been through doctoral students. So we've got 6 that are published, another one coming out, hopefully. The person's gone and picked up a principalship, and so the the final push to finish the thesis is slowing down. And another one halfway through. So we've got a body of literature about that. Now, the interesting thing about middle leaders is I've just done a review for Ken Leithwood and Chingu on middle leaders, and that largely picked up on the standard reviews that have already been out there. But then I put in some contemporary stuff. When you look at the contemporary stuff on middle leaders, we're in Australia doing really well. And Christine and Peter's work, and Karen work, Karen Runneman, on that practice view of middle leaders has been outstanding. It's an outstanding contribution. And then John DeNoble's work on his model, his review of middle leaders, but also his model, his system model is another outstanding contribution. So just heads up to those two groups, people. And then the last thing we've looked at is leadership in context. So the International Successful School Principalship has been focused on leadership in context. That's part of the reason why you do a 25-country study, international study, because you can get into those contextual matters. And most recently, we've been hooking up with Phil Hallinger's recent work on leadership in context and adapting a view that he had and doing papers based on that. Fiona's been involved in one of those papers looking at that. And his work is important. And again, I have to say, just as a heads up, Brian introduced me to Phil in the 90s, and Phil's been a mentor and friend ever since then. So again, just another lovely little connection there. And then we finish with just a couple of statements. We look at leadership and change and market-centered leadership, particularly with Laurie's work, early work, and that notion of leadership in times of uncertainty. So just really capturing our thoughts about how leadership as a way of thinking about behaviours in schools is important for understanding schools. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We'll have time for questions at the end, but because we're now short of time, Pauline, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you about capacity building.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, so it's just my voice you'll be hearing. I hope you can hear it. Thanks to David and Dorothy for the opportunity to be part of this special edition. And thanks to Fiona and Christine for working with David and Dorothy for organising the event. It's a great opportunity to bring people together and to share our research, particularly as we don't have our usual conferences at the moment where we can share our work with everyone. Writing this article was a really interesting process for me to articulate my thinking about how my research can contribute to the vast educational research landscape. I'm an early career researcher. I graduated last year after many decades of working in schools. So my research has come from my experience of working as a teacher, an educational advisor, and as a school leader. So I've been very fortunate to work in all sectors and in country, regional and city schools. I was really interested in investigating the complex link, and this is what I wrote about in this paper, between leadership and student learning, and how leaders can enact their leadership to enhance learning in schools, and how capacity can be built across all levels of leadership. So it was my experience as a school leader which was the impetus for my research into professional learning that I wrote about in the paper. Research was telling me that professional learning was the key lever to improve teaching practice. And I was in a school where I was the assistant principal with a portfolio for learning. And I could see that we were spending a lot of resources, mainly time and money, on professional learning, but not really seeing large scale improvements in teaching practice and not seeing improvements in student learning outcomes. So I conducted a research project in my own school with a group of 7 teachers and worked with them on professional learning, and then tracked their practice over 12 months and then followed up with them 2 years later. So that research resulted in identifying 5 key elements of professional learning which were developed as a model of professional learning, and that's all outlined in the paper. And it's interesting to note that whilst I didn't number them 1 to 5, one of the foundational elements was this whole idea of trusting professional relationships. So I can see links with others' work here. So my ears were pricked up many times. And I'm really pleased to say that this research has been well received by both academics and people working in school which is exactly where I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be, I wanted that clear line of sight to practice. So the second area that I wrote about in the paper that I want to talk about today is building the capacity of middle leaders so that they can enact their leadership. So the whole area of middle leadership is another area of interest that I outlined in the article. Again, this research comes from my experience in schools. As the assistant principal, my key people were my learning area leaders. So your maths coordinator, your science coordinator, etc. It was these people who I relied upon to work with their teams to implement our strategic goals and to support teachers to improve their teaching practice. As a leader, I could do some work with individual teachers, but my main work was with this group. So I'm very excited to hear about all the middle leadership work that's going on. I'm involved in 2 middle leadership projects at the moment. This work is ongoing and is somewhat stalled due to the restrictions we have in place in getting into schools in Victoria at the moment. So both in secondary schools, and secondary schools are really quite complex, interesting, multi-layered places to work out. So one project I'm involved in is working with a group of curriculum leaders as they lead their teams to improve practice. In this project, we're working with leaders to support them on changing their pedagogy, mainly around literacy, and then to understand the leadership practices which might underpin a change. So we're hoping to have some findings together by the end of the year. The second project I'm working on with Helen Stokes, who you've heard from today, and what we're hoping to conduct a large survey with follow-up interviews on middle leadership, specifically focused on those middle curriculum leaders, so your English coordinator and so forth. This will be exciting work. We don't really know what will unfold from the survey and the interviews that we're hoping, and we're hoping to get some research done and published, sometime next year. So building on the good work that's already been undertaken in this area, we're seeking to identify some of the key leadership practices and maybe some of the key support that people need to build the capacity of this group of leaders. So I'm looking forward to adding to the growing body of research in this really important area. The other work, I'd just like to point out that the work that we do, that I'm doing, really aligns closely with the teaching that I'm doing at MGSE, in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. I'm working with current and aspiring school leaders to build their understanding of leadership and how it might be enacted. So it's exciting to be able to share the research with our students. Thanks again for the opportunity to articulate my research agenda and how I might in some way contribute to the overarching educational landscape. I'm really excited to be part of this project and part of the AARE SIG and to work with ACL. I look forward to some future discussions and possible collaborations. So I don't know if I've been 5 minutes, but when I timed it before it was 5 minutes. So I'm hoping it's about that time.
Thank you, Pauline. That's fantastic. And we'd like to also congratulate you on your recent ACEL award as well. Well done.
Thank you.
Scott, can you please provide us with an overview of observations and then we'll have a discussion?
Absolutely, I can. Well, I took a slightly different approach to my contribution to the special issue because I was far too humble to write about myself, so I had to write about the work of others. Awesome. I'm glad some people got that because now I've gone incredibly corporate and I've worn a check shirt to make sure that you can all pay attention to me. It's very hard to forget me. One of the key contribution that I wanted to try to make in this special issue is I feel as though, and I've made this argument for just about to anyone who will listen to me over the last decade, is that we have somewhat of a guru crisis in educational leadership, particularly in Australia. And ACL is arguably one of the leading factors, contributors, influencers, whatever we want to say, in contributing to this guru crisis. Why does this guru crisis actually matter? Because just about every conference I've ever gone to, any school I've ever worked with and any school leader I've ever engaged with has told me that context matters. There's almost a universal agreement that context matters when it comes to schooling. In Australia, we have an incredibly rich history of contributing to educational leadership, educational management, educational administration, whichever label you want to give it. But we have an incredibly rich history. Many of the people who have actually joined us today, or that we've name dropped throughout our various presentations, have contributed and made that rich history what it is today. We also have an incredibly positive future. We look at the number of people who've been presenting today, people who are part of the special issue. I don't count myself as that young anymore, but I look at the next generation coming through, and I think there's an incredibly bright future for the field. So if 2020 has kicked us around in as many different ways as possible, but I think now is actually our chance as the world resets under pandemic, because I'm not sure we're post-pandemic yet. We need to think of how can we actually switch this around, because arguably, you know, it has to start somewhere, it has to start sometime. So what better place than here, and what better time than now? 2020, let's make it happen for Australian educational leadership researchers. How are we going to go about this? I think it's really important that we think about how do we teach the next generation of educational leaders about the history of our field. Where in our programs, for those of us who work in universities, do we have the history of our field, both nationally and internationally? But where do we actually teach that history? Where is it that people get to find out about the work of Peter Gron or Brian Cordwell or Richard Bates or Gabrielle Lukomsky, Colin Evers? You know, we could name drop plenty of people all day, but you know, where do we actually teach people about that? Where do people actually understand why there's a William Walker oration at ACEL? Where do people actually get their frustration when we see that being diluted and given to everyone going, you know, no, I don't know, I'll stop there. The other thing we need to speak back to and think considerably, we are competing with very slick consultants in this space. The edupreneurs, the people who are coming in with really slick presentations, the quick and easy book to sell, and the whole process. What I would say has happened to our field, and this is a major challenge for us going forward, is we are no longer just competing against other researchers and organisations. We are actually competing with entrepreneurs who spend their time curating followership through their social media. And this is a really serious issue for us as we start to go forward and think, how do we start to speak back to this? How do we make sure that Australian educational leaders know about Australian educational leadership research? That's not to the exclusion of what's going on around the world, but it's how do we actually make sure we're aware of what's going on locally? How do we make sure that the school down the road knows about the International Successful School Principals Project? How do we know that the middle school leaders' work that we've heard from multiple groups is actually getting out there? I think this is the greatest challenge we have as a field, as professional associations, and actually as educators in schools. How do we make sure that our educators start to get access to this? Why does all this matter? I go back to my very first point, context matters. If context matters, how do we make sure that we're getting context sensitive research into the hands of the right people? The paper touches on a whole bunch of other loose stuff there around the contribution of various Australian academics over time, but I think the key issue is how do we actually speak back to this guru crisis? And hopefully that's a good kickstart for as we might want to ask questions.
Thanks, Scott, and great to see some clapping as well. Congratulations to everyone who has presented today. Fiona, I'm going to hand over to you for the question time.
Thank you, Chris. Now, we did have a question to start us off, which, Chris, I'm hoping you might have in front of you because I don't.
Yes, I do. Here it is. Let me just move the Twitter out of the way. And thank you to those who have been tweeting throughout, and please continue to. The question that we're going to start off with, for the panel, what is the state and worth of Australian Educational Leadership Scholarship? What is the state and worth of Australian Educational Leadership Scholarship? Why do we get out of bed in the morning and go to work?
I think Scott's contribution obviously leads into that really beautifully, and you know, around that value of we've got this contextual experience in the work that we do within our own country and within our own setting. So you know, obviously that's a really obvious connection. So anyone else from the panel who would like to build on that?
Can I say a couple of things? So if I look through the special issue, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 papers. Two of them are by early career researchers, and that's Fiona and Pauline. And the fact that I think what you're both in your third year, maybe second, third year, that they're able to write a paper about their research agenda is fantastic. And so that bodes well in terms of those people, and of course there are other people. The other thing is that, I mean, look at our screen. This is not bad. I mean, the SIG, this SIG wasn't traveling too well. In fact, I have to confess, I didn't pay any attention to it years ago because there wasn't anything really much to happen. Neil from Tasmania and then Scott really wrestled it back into shape. And so I think that's another positive sign. So there's some nice signs out there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I think, you know, it's the contribution of our SIG, but it's also the contribution of AARE and what the Australian Association for Research and Education stands for in terms of its research values and its Australian research agenda, and the interdisciplinary work that we can do with researchers across education as well, that I think matters in our SIG too. Who else would like to speak? Chris.
Can I say something? I just want to say thank you for everybody for listening to your presentations. One of the things that it strikes me is, talking to, I'm listening to Scott's point, but even feeding into the question is that people are interested in leadership for what it matters, the students in classrooms. So the student engagement and student learning at the school level, that's why we do this kind of work. So what are the kind of practices at any kind of level, as a teacher, as a student, as a middle leader in the or consultant, or even at the school level executive. So I think one of the beautiful things about looking around this screen is that it's a 360 view of why we need leading and where it's heading. And I think that's why it seems to me, and I'm kind of not, being a literacy educator interested in student learning, that, how do I support that is through understanding leading. So I think, that's all I want to say.
And can I add to that? I think it's really about that importance of when you're teaching in the area, like we teach in the instructional leadership area, when you're talking with the why they come to do the further study, it's because they want to make a difference for the kids in their school. But that's also the reason that we're doing the research as well. And so much of the research that's been presented today has been that link between what's actually happening in the school, what matters for the kids, and then what also in terms of how the teachers can make a difference with that, and with leadership linked with that. So you've got to see that sort of connection all the way through. That's really important in terms of the research that we're doing.
Yeah. And I just add that this is just a little window into the excellent research that's being done throughout Australia. So I'm quite conscious that, and I can see people on the screen that are not in this this edition, probably should be, but we need a much bigger book to be able to do that. And I think maybe that's something we need to feature next year, is other people that are contributing to education. It's an incredible rich source of knowledge that's available. But unfortunately, one of the big organisations that could probably contribute to its greater distribution hasn't done so. However, depending upon what happens after Asha's demise, wherever she's gone to, that there is an advisory group, and that group hopefully will be reinvigorated once the new CEO is appointed. So we're still in there battling.
Thanks, Dorothy. Lisa's written an excellent question. And if you look in the chat box, you can see that there's lots of comments and a few questions coming. And Lisa's written the question, how do we promote educational leadership within leadership teams in schools more readily? Would anyone on the panel or not on the panel like to have a go at that one?
Oh, that sounds good. I'm just thinking, I almost sort of said, well, I guess that's our aspirational work every time we are invited, and it isn't always an invitation, to work with a school community and a whole school, because I mean, all the wonderful work we've just been listening to, is all a vital part of that whole alignment of a school. school organisation, school alignment is such an important part of it. And, you know, the work we do with schools is not possible unless we work with a team. And it's not just your leadership team or your more experienced. We've been through cases where we've even had the main facilitator of these groups being, you know, very early career person. And enabling that sort of thing from ground up, because very often at the end of a time with these, well, you sort of never end if they don't close the door on you, but very often I'll say to this group of people, have you changed? You know, and I'm thinking, you jolly well have changed. And they get puff up, yeah. Well, what is it? That in itself is sort of owning and becoming aware of their qualities of whatever it is, you know, leadership, pedagogical leadership, leadership within a whole school. So,
Joan, thank you for that answer. I sort of had a bit of an addendum to that sort of picking up on Scott's point of our contextual gurus, that at a system level where we look to Canada for trying to improve school improvement, but we're not looking within. So that's my concern. So how do schools and how do leadership find out about the work that educational researchers do? Because I'm actually just doing my master's at the moment in ed leadership. So coming into this forum is way above my pay grade, but it's amazing to listen to.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, go Scott.
Yeah, I think there's multiple factors that go to how you find out about that work. One, I think as people who work in universities, I think it should be our job to also promote the work of our colleagues nationally. Like, we're too small a country to be ignoring one another. And that's something that goes on in educational leadership, you know, throughout time and space. You know, we just ignore each other, especially if we don't agree with each other. So I think there's part of it that we need to acknowledge and support one another there. The second part is I think we need to consider how we connect as well. Like, there's social media and there's lots of other ways where we can directly connect to educational leaders, you know, those who are doing master's degrees elsewhere. I think they're really important. The obsession with I was going to say shiny things from afar, but that's not really fair. One part of that actually is the need for us to be far more critical as well. You know, lots of the people we engage with who will say they're critiquing germ don't actually realise they are germ. Because, you know, if you're going around the world sharing your version of how things should be, you are germ. So I think we need to make sure we're a lot more critical of that as an audience as well, especially those folks of them that don't do research at all or say stupid things like, I'm coming to this country to try to fix inequities that have existed. If we actually think about those things, it's ridiculous. So I think part of that's an interesting thing around, we go around leadership preparation and development. I think that's an ongoing challenge for our country as more and more systems offer it, as opposed to universities. There's a lot of system socialization and you ignore a lot of the other stuff's going on. So I know that's a really roundabout sort of way of doing that, but I think it requires a multi-approach to getting the research into the hands of the people who need it, where we all take responsibility for looking after one another. We find as many different ways to connect with professionals as possible, and we try to educate the people working in schools to be as critical as possible of the people the false prophets that we have who are here to try to make profit off what we're doing.
Thanks, Scott. I think I'm on the same bandwagon.
Any other questions?
Just like to say, I think Chris would be happy to have anyone from the audience make a comment, you know, acknowledging that we've got some people who've got a lot of history in this space in Australia, and we'd love to hear from you. I think Peter might be just about to join in.
Christine, I wonder if I could weigh in on some of Scott's points, if that's acceptable. Peter Gron is my name. I'm now well retired and I'm working on other projects, and I want to thank Fiona for giving me the opportunity to be part of today. I've read the Symposium papers, and there's an element of gloom running throughout them, which I guess is captured in Scott's notion of guru capture, or whatever he likes to call it, guru crisis. It's evident to me, as someone who's been in this field for a long period of time, that a lot of you are achieving very good things. You're clearly doing a lot of excellent work with your students in your courses because you're transmitting or engaging with them in a lot of the knowledge you're talking about today. You're engaging with the wider educational community through your publications. And those of you that have been doing contract research for tender purposes, for state agencies and other bodies, you've been producing findings which have been productive to them. So whilst there might be some gloom evident, I think there are a lot of positives that I can see as well. What strikes me is that another thing is that there's a lot of overlap, I think, and I'm not the first person to draw attention to that this afternoon, in the articles. One of the areas which leapt out in 2 or 3 papers was the commonality of thinking around the notion of trust. Now, it seems to me if the knowledge that's being produced in the field is going to have an impact, it somehow has to be consolidated. There's got to be a point of focus for bringing together all of the various projects that Melbourne's engaged in, Southern Queensland's engaged in, and so on. Now, the typical way that professions do this is to create a college. I've been in the UK for about 10 years and have just arrived back. And of course, there's a chartered college of teaching now over there, which I was one of the movers and shakers in getting that established. And what they're trying to do is bring together a body of knowledge on which they can define some professional standards. So I think if you're going to have an impact on bodies like the ACEL and others, you've got to be able to find a way of bringing that material together and consolidating it as a workable body of knowledge which defines where the field is at. The other thing I suppose I want to say is that, and I don't know the history here in relation to the ACEL, if there is in fact a guru crisis, and this is an organisation which is siphoning money to high profile international people, one of the ways in which you might want to, the strategies you might want to think about in relation to that is setting up a dialogue with them, familiarising them with the body of research in the field at the moment, ascertaining what their expectations are and what they want and what they're trying to do. Now, that dialogue may already be going on, I don't know, but if it isn't, it ought to be going on. So they're just a few thoughts that I've got as a result of what I've heard today and certainly what I've read in the symposium.
Thanks so much, Peter, for sharing. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad to have you here and some of the other people who've been important for me over the last few years, Jane and Brian and a few others as well. Thank you for being here. Anyone else like to make some comments around that? I think the connections between ACL and our group are things that we keep talking about a lot, and yeah, we appreciate any insights as well. So thank you.
And just following on from what Peter said, we have had success in opening up a dialogue with ACEL, but it's a bit stalled because Asha's left and it was what she was creating, which was quite exciting in terms of connecting university researchers with ACEL. But what happens now, once I guess it's a bit of a wait and see who the new leader is going to be, and then we need to continue that. So I deliberately put in the L&M, the advisory committee, just to keep them in tune with the fact that we actually are not going away. So I think that's important. I think having that dialogue, that Scott has been involved in that as well, Simon Clark and a few others that are in that group.
Thanks, Dorothy. Are there any other questions or comments?
I had a question. Oops, I had a question for Fiona, if that's okay. Fiona, just really interested and excited by your work in student agency, been fortunate to be on the ground in that type of work in the NT. And I guess, and you were talking about some of the theoretical underpinnings that you're currently working on. I'm just wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that further. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. and by the way, thank you for an amazing presentation, and thank you to everyone. I've learned a great deal tonight.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for being here. Tanya's an old friend and colleague from a long time.
Pleasure.
Doing some amazing work, yeah, with student agency stuff in the Northern Territory. I guess for me, it was, you know, it's really those issues around power and the structures and arrangements within school, and how words like choice and agency and voice are all kind of intermingled. So I've been doing some work with a research assistant trying to, you know, go back and unpack where some of these things came from. So I've been looking at Dewey and Illich and a few other theorists, just trying to pull apart some threads, and we're going to try and put together a paper that explores some of those ideas soon. But we've only been doing it for a month or so, so not too much to share just yet, but that's the plan.
Thank you. That sounds exciting. Please share it with me.
Yeah, will do.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya.
Pleasure.
I was just going to jump in and comment, I think, on the big topic of, you know, how we put our work forward and how we, you know, reach these goals that we've been talking about both today and in other forums that we've been together in. How great it is to have these networks and these, you know, events, and, you know, how much I appreciate seeing lots of people that I've spoken with before and connected with, and taking these opportunities and prioritising them to talk together. And I think it goes to the point perhaps that Peter made around, you know, we're kind of, if we can come together in some ways, we're stronger in terms of putting ourselves out there. So hopefully events like this and further things, maybe formal things or further special issues or whatever it might be, I think really will help us be visible within our country and to the people we want to make a difference for. So, yeah.
I completely second that. Thanks, Fiona. As a co-convener, I'd like to say that the work that Fiona and I are doing with ARE is ultimately for you. It's so that you each can connect with each other and promote Australia-wide research. That's why we are the Australian Association for Research and Education. And I know that for me personally, when I was a doctoral student, the connections that I made with people who even then read and examined my thesis, but what I learned, the aha moments I then had as a student in coming along to the conference and connecting with people in the leadership research SIG and more broadly, and then going on as an early career researcher to build former bridges and connections with other colleagues has been invaluable through this association. And so although this has been an open event and in many ways a connection with ASAIL as well, because it's about the ASAIL journal leading and managing, it's very much ARE that has been the host of this event, and we would like to encourage you, although it's been open to guests, to join ARE so that you too can actually benefit from these connections and associations and contribute no matter how long you have been a researcher for. That's what we're here for.
I'll just jump in there while we're doing that sort of love in as well. And I would say as a doctoral student, like when I was doing my master's and when I was doing my doctoral student, and then even as an early career researcher and active, like I benefited both from ACEL and AARE. And, you know, there's a lot of people on here, you know, I met Brian through ACEL conferences, the same with Tanya, like, you know, people that I've met on social media, you get to meet them at these conferences. So I think setting up these sort of places is really, you know, being part of and participating in them is really important as well. So I just thought I'd join in while you're saying all those nice things, Chris. And make sure, I don't want Peter to think that I'm all doom and gloom either, because I must say, I'd like to say in my paper, I point out the bright future that we have to go along with our rich history. I just got a bit ranty today.
No, it's wonderful, and thank you. And we do produce a monthly newsletter for members that is purely about educational leadership research, that's about your research. You can email us and send us what you want to say, and we will publish it for you, and it will go Australia-wide. So we're here for you to publish your work and to connect other people. We're looking at ways we can connect people who haven't got work and ways that we can promote early career research and student research as well. So it's a place we are the meeting place. Someone's just asked, so David's just asked, thank you, Katrina, for posting the membership details. So when you become a member, you can join our SIG as well, and then you can have access to the newsletter and all those sorts of treats. Any other research questions or other questions? And John de Nobile has just made a really interesting point too about Australian Educational Leader, which is the research journal for the Australian Association of Research in Education, which is absolutely going gangbusters. And it's certainly a space that we are keen to, that many of our members already do publish in as well, in the leadership space there. So that's a good go-to place. They also have shorter, do you call them blog posts? They have shorter posts that are accessible as well, that are a good place to go to for a quick summary of research too.
So that's Australian Educational Researcher is the AARE journal. So John's talked about the Australian Educational Leader, which is the ACL journal, which is great.
ACL is good too. I published in that one too.
Yeah. So I think the message is that there is actually quite a number of really good Australian spaces, and everyone's jumping on to Journal of Education, Admin and History is, we've got Jane and Amanda here who are the editors of that. So we've just got such rich opportunities in Australia, and I guess just trying to be aware of them and go to them and share them and use them, in our teaching and our work as much as possible. So we are all building each other up as much as we can. Unless anyone wants to...
Can I just make just one comment? I can't. I have to do this because we're talking about the use of our research, and this will annoy Scott, but of course the person who really has jumped from not known in the educational community but not known in the school practice community is John Hattie, and of course the book that did that was Visible Learning, and then the subsequent books. So the point of saying that is that there are ways to get into schools, and I suppose as a group we need to perhaps think creatively about how to do that, because quite literally John was known to us, but not widely known. And I mean, a Mazzano would have been better known in schools because again there was a book that went with it. So I mean, it's been interesting to watch because he came to Melbourne at the time that Visible Learning was published, and then it's just, I mean, he's just gone nuts since then. And
fighting then.
Huh? Yeah.
Fighting everyone.
Oh well, that's right. Yeah, that's another story. But just like I said, just in terms of that influence at a school level, it's been quite phenomenal. So it's not that we can't do it; it's just a question of how we can go about that. And I think this SIG is a great forum for that, and ACL is, and just a hats off to ACL for those New Voice scholarships that have been around for a few years, because they really are a wonderful initiative. And I know Pauline gets to go to the conference next year. She gets writing opportunities and speaking opportunities. So you're going to hear more from her. So, but thank you for this. It's been great. Thank you.
And we also have an open invitation to anyone who wants to come and do writing with us monthly. And if you want to hear about different educational leadership journals that are being promoted that you might want to write in, we always start with an editor as well. So that's an open invitation. You don't have to be a member of ARE to join that, but it is open. So we hope to see you at those events as well, no matter where you're at in terms of your career.
Awesome. Well, I think maybe that's almost time to wrap up, and I just want to again thank everyone for coming along and being here. I just want to point out also we had sort of over 50 registrations, which was fantastic. A few people obviously couldn't quite make it, and that's fine. We have recorded the session, and people have asked if we can share that. If you have any issues with that, just shoot me an email. I put my email address in the chat before and let me know. But otherwise we'll hopefully make that available. And yes, so some of the people that had registered, do have positions of interest within systems and so forth. So it'd be great, to make our research work through this forum available to them to have a look at a bit more broadly. Other than that, I think Chris and I and, others that are involved with our SIG would welcome any connection or ideas or communications from anyone. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to follow anything up with us or with any of our authors from tonight. We'd really welcome that opportunity. Okay, Chris, I'll say thanks very much to everyone. Do you want to say good evening as well? Thanks for a great job, Chris.
Evening, and no, thank you, Fiona, for all your organisation. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Great. And thanks so much to all the authors who joined us. It was great.
Thank you, authors.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.